Imagine a man so powerful that he went to great lengths to protect his throne, not even when faced with the birth of a baby that threatened his crown. Herod the Great, the king who tried to end Jesus, lived a life marked by the incessant search for power, but ended up paying a terrible price for his choices. Have you ever felt that, in your desperation to keep something you love or fear losing, you end up making decisions that you deeply regret? Herod experienced exactly this, but in catastrophic proportions. He persecuted, manipulated, and destroyed everything to discover that the true power is not in the throne, but in something much greater. In this video, you will understand how Herod's tragic end reveals a powerful lesson. No matter how much we control, there are consequences for our choices and a path to redeem even the most serious mistakes. Prepare for a final shock that will transform your perspective on power, ambition, and redemption. Before we start, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? Because this is just the first in an epic series about the Roman world, full of details and curiosities that you won't want to miss. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of Rome, with teeming crowds, crowded markets, and imposing palaces in the background. It was in this scenario of glory and chaos that Marcus Licinius Crassus was born, a young man destined to shape the history of the Roman Empire. He came into the world in a privileged family, surrounded by luxury and power. His father, a prominent Roman senator, already had a solid reputation and vast estates. For Crassus, this meant a starting point that many dreamed of reaching. But he didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps. He wanted to surpass him. Since he was little, Crassus showed an unusual sparkle in his eyes. He was cunning, observant, and had a rare ability to understand power, even at a young age. While other young Romans his age had fun in the public baths or in the arenas, Crassus was alongside his elders, learning about politics, war, and, above all, money. He understood that in Rome, power and wealth went hand in hand. But life was not all gold and banquets for Crassus. Rome, at that time, was a true social and political battlefield. Rivalries between powerful families not only determined who ruled, but also who survived. Crassus' family faced opposition from other influential clans, such as the Scipios and the Julii. This constant struggle for supremacy forged in Crassus an insatiable ambition. He didn't want to be just another name on the long list of Roman nobles. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest. His ambition was not limited to the accumulation of wealth, although he was obsessed with it. Crassus knew that true power in Rome came from strategic alliances and control over the masses. He observed how politicians like Caio Mario and Lucio Cornelio Sulla used their fortunes to influence elections, finance armies, and ensure loyalties. Crassus decided he would do the same, but with more intelligence, more boldness, and, if necessary, more brutality. Crassus' youth was marked by moments of learning, but also by trials. His family faced setbacks during the civil wars, and he lost much of his property. However, Crassus was resilient. He saw each defeat as an opportunity to learn and reinvent himself. It was during this period that he began to build the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. A man who always found a way to turn losses into profits. Over time, Crassus would stand out for his ability to accumulate an unimaginable fortune, taking advantage of crises and uncertainties to buy properties at ridiculous prices and then resell them for exorbitant profits. But for now, he was just an ambitious young man, driven by grandiose dreams and the certainty that Rome had not yet seen everything he was capable of doing. And so began the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man whose thirst for power and wealth would lead him to become one of the most controversial and fascinating figures in the history of Rome. Fate is not always generous, even with those who are born surrounded by riches. Marcus Licinius Crassus, with his youth full of promise and his powerful family, saw everything turn to dust during the bloody civil wars of Rome. At that time, two colossal forces clashed. The supporters of Caio Mario, defender of popular reforms, and the followers of Lucio Cornelio Sulla, an aristocrat determined to protect the privileges of the elite. Crassus and his family, linked to Marius' faction, were drawn into the eye of this political hurricane. The civil wars were not just battles in the field. They infiltrated the streets of Rome, the homes of noble families, and even the most intimate relationships. When Sulla returned triumphant from Greece and marched on Rome, he brought with him not only soldiers but a list of enemy outlaws marked for death. For the Licinius Crassus, this meant ruin. The luxury and security that Crassus had known since he was a child evaporated in a matter of days. The family's properties were confiscated, allies disappeared, and the name Licinius became synonymous with treason in the eyes of Sulla's followers. It was at this moment that Crassus faced his first great trial, the loss of everything his family had accumulated for generations. But the real tragedy for Crassus was not just losing his fortune. He saw his family being dismantled. His father and older brother were captured and killed by Sulla's forces. These events left deep marks on his soul, shaping the man he would become. Crassus, only in his early 20s, was forced to flee to save his life. He found refuge in Hispania, a distant and harsh land that still bore the scars of ancient Roman conquests. It was not the kind of place where a young man of nobility would hope to rebuild his life, but Crassus had no choice. He took shelter in a small village near Merida Augusta, present-day Merida, living in an isolated cave and depending on the generosity of a few loyal friends. For someone who had grown up surrounded by banquets and wealth, life in Hispania was a cruel blow. Crassus, however, was resilient. He did not lament his lot. He planned his return. During the months he lived in hiding, he heard rumors about the political maneuvers in Rome, Sulla's advances and Marius's defeats. Crassus knew that the tides of war were changing quickly and that he would need to be prepared to seize the opportunity when it arose. Meanwhile, he began to rebuild his fortune in humble but ingenious ways. Using his cunning and charisma, Crassus gained the trust of the locals and began negotiating small plots of land and livestock. Every coin he earned was a step towards recovery. He learned to observe local market cycles, understand people's desires, and, above all, to survive with very little. These years in Hispania were more than a period of exile. They were the forging of a ruthless man. Crassus would emerge from this phase of life with a new perspective. He knew what it was like to lose everything and was determined never to go through that again. When Sulla finally consolidated his power in Rome, Crassus saw his chance to return, now more cautious, more cunning, and, above all, more ambitious. The flight to Hispania was not just a physical escape. It was an internal journey, where Crassus discovered what it really meant to fight for survival. When he finally returned to Rome, he was ready to begin rewriting its history, not as the heir to a fortune, but as the man who would build the greatest wealth Rome had ever seen. When Crassus returned to Rome after years of exile in Hispania, he found a transformed city. The chaos of the civil war had left deep marks. Streets full of rubble, abandoned houses, and a climate of distrust that hovered over everyone. Sulla's political violence had not only changed rulers, but also ruined countless families, leaving a trail of despair. For Crassus, however, this scenario of destruction was the perfect opportunity to start over. With his sharp mind and burning ambition, Crassus saw what few others could. Chaos was also a chance to build something new. He understood that while many mourned their losses, he could profit. Sulla's policy of proscription, which branded opponents of the regime as traitors, condemned hundreds of wealthy Romans to death. Their properties were confiscated and sold at ridiculous prices, a true feast for anyone with resources and daring. Crassus, even though he had lost almost everything, still maintained valuable contacts. He began to gather what little was left of his fortune, enlisting the support of allies willing to invest in his vision. He actively participated in the auctions organized by Sulla's government, purchasing noble properties that had belonged to ruined families. Each house, farm, or land acquired was purchased at a price far below its real value. It was almost as if he was turning ashes into gold. But Crassus didn't just stop at purchasing. He had a gift for transforming the ordinary into extraordinary. The properties he acquired were revitalized, rebuilt, and resold at much higher prices. He employed slaves to speed up construction and... So, did you already know this story about ancient Rome? Tell us in the comments. I want to know what you think. Ensuring that everything was done with maximum efficiency. His attention to detail and his ability to understand market needs made him a skilled trader. He didn't just buy land. He created value from them. Furthermore, Crassus found an even more ingenious way to profit: financing political campaigns and military ventures. He began lending money to Sulla's allies and other rising leaders, ensuring that in return they remained indebted to him. It was a strategy that went beyond material wealth. He was building a network of power that would make him indispensable in Rome. The pinnacle of his ingenuity, however, was his ability to manage crises. Crassus was famous for organizing his own brigade of slaves trained to fight fires, a common problem in Rome at the time. He bought burning properties or those threatened with destruction at low prices, taking advantage of the owner's desperation. Afterwards, he sent his brigade to put out the fire and rebuild the properties, which were resold for a fortune. This practice, although controversial, showed how Crassus was a master at transforming disasters into opportunities. Over the years, Crassus accumulated such a gigantic fortune that his fame spread throughout Rome. He was not just rich. He was the richest man in the city, perhaps in all of Roman history up to that point. His wealth, however, was not just the result of luck or circumstance. It was the result of a calculating mind, limitless ambition, and an unparalleled ability to take advantage of every opportunity that arose, even in the worst situations. Crassus's resurgence is proof that he not only survived the chaos of civil war, he thrived in it. His story is that of someone who knew how to turn every loss into a step towards the top, building a fortune that not only guaranteed his position in Rome, but also placed him among the most powerful figures of his time. If chaos was the battlefield, Crassus was the general who knew how to win every war. The name Spartacus echoed throughout Rome like a thunder of revolt and defiance. The former slave, a gladiator of Thracian origin, had led a revolt that shook the foundations of the Roman Empire. For years, Spartacus and his followers, an army made up of escaped slaves, peasants, and malcontents, repeatedly defeated the Roman legions, turning their flight into an unprecedented resistance movement. For Rome, defeating him was not only a military issue, but also a need to restore order and reassert its rule. And it was in this scenario that Marco Licinio Crasso entered the scene, determined to show that he was the right man to end the threat and, at the same time, solidify his position as one of the most powerful leaders in Rome. At that time, Crassus was already known for his immense wealth and insatiable ambition, but his military career still needed a triumph that would guarantee him prestige. When the Roman Senate found itself trapped, unable to contain Spartacus' revolt, Crassus offered to lead the army against the rebels. He didn't just want to win. He needed this victory to consolidate his influence and prove that he was more than a businessman. Crassus' campaign began with harsh measures. He knew that part of the problem with previous Roman defeats came from a lack of discipline in the legions. Thus, he reintroduced an ancient and brutal practice: decimation. If a unit failed or retreated in combat, 1 in 10 soldiers was chosen by lot and executed by their own comrades. This ruthless strategy sent a clear message: failure would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Spartacus and his followers continued to evade Roman traps, displaying impressive tactical skills. Crassus, however, was a cunning strategist. He began to surround the rebels, using his wealth to finance massive fortifications and ensure that Spartacus had nowhere to flee. He built a line of trenches and fortifications along the peninsula where the rebels were trapped, cutting off their access to supplies and forcing them to fight at a disadvantage. The final confrontation was a spectacle of determination and blood. Spartacus, knowing there was no longer any escape, personally led his men in a last, desperate battle. He fought with fierce courage, but Crassus's better equipped and disciplined forces prevailed. Spartacus fell in combat, and his followers were massacred or captured. For Crassus, the victory was complete. He not only crushed the revolt, but also sent a powerful message to all of Rome. Slaves would never again dare to rise up against their masters. As a show of power and to reinforce fear, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, the main road leading to Rome. Each cross was a symbol of their victory and a warning to anyone who dared challenge Roman power. With Spartacus' defeat, Crassus secured his rise to military and political power. He became an indispensable figure in Rome, someone whose name was now associated not only with wealth, but also with strength and discipline. This victory paved the way for him to join Pompey and Julius Caesar in the First Triumvirate, cementing his place among the most powerful men of his time. The Third Servile War was not just a war for Crassus. It was his chance to prove himself on a bigger stage. By defeating Spartacus, he not only restored order to Rome, but also wrote his name in history as the man who knew how to transform an immense challenge into a definitive triumph. The victory against Spartacus had brought Marcus Licinius Crassus something he had always sought: fame. He was no longer just the richest man in Rome or a master of finance. He was now recognized as a victorious general, someone who had defended the Republic in a time of crisis. However, what should have been the height of their glory quickly became a scene of frustration and rivalry. All because of one name, Pompey the Great. Pompey, Rome's favorite, was already a notorious figure. He had won impressive victories in campaigns abroad, such as in Hispania and the East, and his triumphant return to Rome was always accompanied by grand celebrations. While Crassus was busy defeating Spartacus, Pompey, who had fought the last pockets of the slave revolt, strategically capitalized on the moment. He arrived in Rome before Crassus and claimed much of the credit for suppressing the revolt, even if his participation was minor. This was a blow to Crassus, who had put his entire reputation on the line in the campaign against Spartacus. He hoped that Rome would recognize his efforts as the pillar of victory. Instead, the city's eyes were on Pompey, whose political ability to promote himself was as impressive as his battlefield achievements. The tension between the two men was evident. While Crassus relied on his wealth and connections to gain political influence, Pompey was the darling of the Senate and the masses. He had charisma, something that Crassus lacked, who was seen by many as a cold and calculating man, more interested in accumulating power and money than inspiring people. When it came time to compete for the consulate, the highest magistracy in the Roman Republic, the rivalry reached its peak. Crassus and Pompey were natural candidates, but their relationship was marked by mutual distrust. Both knew they would need each other to guarantee victory, but the partnership was far from harmonious. The joint consulate of Crassus and Pompey in 70 BC was a scene of veiled conflicts. Pompey, more popular, dominated public attention, while Crassus sought to strengthen his position through economic reforms and support for strategic allies. The dynamic between the two was clear. Crassus had the resources, Pompey had the popular support. But Crassus felt that he was always one step behind, overshadowed by his rival's brilliance. Despite their differences, the two knew they needed to maintain an alliance of convenience. Rome was in a time of instability, and the rivalry between them could easily be exploited by other ambitious politicians. Still, the tension didn't disappear. Crassus, proud and deeply ambitious, hated being seen as the second man in the hierarchy of power. He began investing further in his network of influence, offering generous loans to politicians and financing military campaigns by other allies. His objective was clear: to build an empire of loyalties that would allow him to rival Pompey on all fronts. However, he knew that financial influence alone would not be enough. He needed a grand military victory, something that could erase Pompey's shadow and put him in the spotlight. Fame and rivalry with Pompey not only shaped Crassus's trajectory, but also influenced Rome's politics for years. The fight between these two titans showed how power in Rome was not just a matter of strength or money. It was a combination of charisma, strategy, and the ability to win the heart of the city. Before continuing with the story, a quick reminder. Have you already liked this video? This helps YouTube spread our content to more Roman history fans like you. It's simple and free. The cost? Now, let's go back to Rome. Crassus had wealth and determination, but Pompey had something that not all the fortune in the world could buy: the love of the masses. And so, the duel between these two giants would continue to define the future of Rome, with Crassus always searching for a way to escape his rival's shadow and achieve the greatness he believed was his destiny. Rome, at the height of its glory, was a boiling cauldron of ambition, rivalry, and intrigue. In the midst of this scenario, three men stood out as the most powerful figures in the Republic: Marcus Licinius Crassus, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. Each of them possessed a unique strength, but they also faced obstacles that they could not overcome alone. This is how one of the most intriguing and decisive alliances in Roman history was born: the First Triumvirate. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, known for his ability to turn any opportunity into profit. He dominated finances, but his political influence always seemed less than he desired, especially in the presence of Pompey. Pompey the Great, was the military hero of the Republic with a history of impressive victories and the support of the masses. However, he faced resistance from the Senate, which feared his growing power. And then there was Julius Caesar, an ambitious and charismatic politician, but still without the resources or solid military base that his two allies possessed. Each had something the other needed, and that made the alliance irresistible. Crassus wanted more political power and a military victory that would put him on the same level as Pompey. Pompey needed financial support to sustain his campaigns and expand his power base against the senatorial elite. And Caesar, the youngest of the three, needed both Crassus' money and Pompey's military prestige to build his own rise. Thus, in 60 BC, the three men reached a secret agreement. They did not make the alliance official with titles or public ceremonies. The Senate would never accept that. But, behind the scenes, they joined forces to dominate Rome's politics and ensure that its interests were protected. The triumvirate began to function relentlessly. With the support of Crassus and Pompey, Caesar managed to be elected consul, the most important position in the Republic. During his tenure, he worked tirelessly to pass laws that benefited his allies. One of them was the redistribution of land to Pompey's veterans, something that further increased the latter's popularity. Meanwhile, Crassus used his financial influence to secure the loyalty of senators and magistrates. He also continued to expand his business, accumulating more wealth and purchasing strategic properties throughout Rome. Although his wealth was a powerful weapon, Crassus knew he still needed something more than a grandiose military triumph that would solidify his position in the alliance. But the triumvirate was not without tensions. Pompey and Crassus continued to compete for influence, and both were suspicious of the growing popularity of Caesar, who was beginning to stand out as the main beneficiary of the alliance. Despite this, the three maintained the pact, knowing that the union was their best defense against the Senate and other political threats. The triumvirate also did not limit itself to domestic politics. Each of the members used the alliance to expand their ambitions. Caesar left for Gaul, where he would lead one of the most legendary military campaigns in Roman history, conquering vast territories and accumulating wealth and glory. Pompey was consolidating his control in the east, while Crassus, always in search of greatness, looked to the Middle East, where he dreamed of a spectacular victory against the Parthian Empire. This alliance of giants was, at the same time, a masterpiece of strategy and a time bomb. Each man pursued his own interests, and although they joined forces, their individual ambitions were too great to coexist for long. Still, while it lasted, the First Triumvirate changed the course of Roman history, transforming the Republic into a political battlefield where three men shaped the destiny of an empire. Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar knew that absolute power could never be shared, but for a brief moment, they formed a triad that ruled Rome with cunning, strength, and vision. What began as a pragmatic alliance would soon become the prelude to even more intense rivalries that would bring Rome to its knees and forever change the course of its history. Marcus Licinius Crassus had everything that many Romans desired: incomparable wealth, political influence, and a name that echoed through the halls of power. But for him, that wasn't enough. The shadow of Pompey and Julius Caesar hung over his ambition. Pompey was the hero who had conquered lands in the east, while Caesar, with his impressive victories in Gaul, was celebrated as an invincible commander. Crassus, on the other hand, was seen as the man of money, not the man of the sword, and it consumed him. In Rome, military prestige was the true measure of greatness. It was not enough to be rich or influential. It was necessary to win battles, march triumphantly through the streets of the city, followed by legions and prisoners, while the people acclaimed his name. It was this kind of glory that Crassus desperately wanted, but still eluded him. He set his sights on a lofty target: the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were known for their wealth, their armies of mounted archers, and their ability to challenge even Rome's most disciplined forces. Defeating them would be no easy task, but for Crassus, it was the perfect opportunity to cement his legacy. He believed that a victory against the Parthians would be enough to put him on the same level or even above Pompey and Caesar. Convinced that this campaign would be his path to glory, Crassus used his influence to secure command of a legion. Many in Rome questioned his decision. He was better known for his financial strategies than his military skill. Furthermore, the Parthians were formidable enemies, and a campaign against them was not only risky but extremely ambitious. But Crassus was blinded by his obsession. He didn't see the risks as just the promise of fame. Before leaving, Crassus gathered a sizable army, made up not only of experienced soldiers, but also of young Romans seeking adventure and wealth. He used his fortune to equip his troops with the best weapons and supplies, believing that gold could guarantee victory. He also promised the soldiers unimaginable riches, as the Parthian Empire was known for its opulence. However, there were warning signs from the start. Many senators tried to dissuade him, pointing out that the campaign was unnecessary and dangerous. Even the people of Rome seemed divided. They saw Crassus as a man seeking personal glory, while others expected him to bring new lands and treasures to the Republic. Crassus, however, was unyielding. He saw this endeavor not just as a military campaign, but as a chance to rewrite his history. He wanted the Romans to remember him as a conqueror, someone who had faced and defeated one of Rome's most powerful enemies. No matter the price, he was willing to risk everything. When Crassus and his army marched to the east, the atmosphere was one of expectation and tension. Many wondered if he would be able to overcome the challenges and return triumphant. For Crassus, there was no doubt. He believed this was his time to shine, his chance to throw off the shadow of Pompey and Caesar and carve his name in history as one of Rome's greatest generals. However, excessive ambition is often accompanied by dangers that cannot be predicted. As Crassus advanced toward Parthian territory, he had no idea that his quest for military prestige would lead him to face not only a powerful enemy, but also the limits of his own leadership abilities. His obsession with his military legacy was about to set him on a path that would change his life and the history of Rome forever. Marco Licinio Crasso's march towards Parthia began as an undertaking of great ambition and confidence. He led an army of approximately 40,000 men, including well-trained Roman legionaries and auxiliary troops. With his immense personal treasure, Crassus equipped his soldiers with the best weapons and provisions, convinced that his wealth and Roman standards of military discipline would guarantee victory. He believed he was destined to triumph where others never dared. But the reality of war would soon undermine his confidence. Crassus profoundly underestimated the Parthians, a fatal error that would soon become evident. The Parthian army was not like the enemies Rome faced in the west or even in the lands of Gaul. They did not rely on rigid formations or hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they mastered the art of archery on horseback, with mounted archers who could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while moving quickly across the battlefield. This combination of mobility and attack strength was something that the Romans, accustomed to more static combat, were not prepared to face. From the beginning of the campaign, problems began to accumulate. Crassus decided to cross the Mesopotamian desert, ignoring advice from local allies who suggested a safer and more strategic route along the Euphrates River. He believed that the desert would shorten the path and catch the Parthians by surprise. But instead, he exposed his army to unrelenting heat, lack of adequate supplies, and extreme fatigue. When he finally encountered the Parthians on the battlefield, Crassus made another crucial mistake. He ordered his legions to form a dense, compact battle line, expecting a traditional battle. But the Parthians had other plans. They surrounded the Roman forces and began to fire an incessant rain of arrows. It was as if the sky was falling on the legionnaires. Parthian archers were experts in a technique called Parthian shooting, which allowed them to shoot arrows with precision while retreating. This created an illusion of escape that lured the Romans into deadly traps. Parthian arrows were so powerful that they could pierce Roman armor, and Crassus's soldiers, unprotected and cornered, began to fall in large numbers. Meanwhile, Crassus' pride and stubbornness prevented him from retreating. He believed that a withdrawal would be seen as a sign of weakness, something he could not accept. Instead, he insisted on fighting, even when it became clear that the Parthians were completely dominating the field. The final blow came with the entry of the cataphractories, the heavy cavalry of the Parthians. These knights, armed with long spears and protected by shining metal armor, were like human tanks, crushing any Roman resistance. The combination of swift archers and devastating cavalry was too much for Crassus's legions. The battle culminated on the plain of Carus, where the Roman army was crushed. More than 20,000 soldiers were killed, while another 10,000 were captured. Crassus himself, surrounded and without a way out, was forced to negotiate with the Parthians. But even in this last attempt, his impetuous temper and lack of diplomatic skills betrayed him. During negotiations, a heated argument led to his capture and death. Legend has it that the Parthians, mocking Crassus's obsession with wealth, poured molten gold into his mouth, a cruel and symbolic fate that marked the end of his quest for glory and power. The Parthian campaign was not just a military disaster. It was a humiliation that shook the Roman Republic. Crassus, who sought a legacy of greatness, became a tragic example of how excessive ambition can lead to ruin. His defeat left a deep mark on Roman history and sealed his name not as a glorious conqueror, but as the man whose obsession with military prestige brought him to an infamous end. It was the year 53 BC, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was marching towards what he believed would be his final glory. He led an army of approximately 40. What did you think of the story? Was there a character or detail that impressed you the most? Share in the comments. I want to hear your ideas. 1,000 men, believing that their Roman legions were invincible. But on the arid plain of Carus, in the lands of Parthia, his confidence would be shattered. This battle would not only mark the end of his life, but would also be remembered as one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. It all started with Crassus's wrong choice regarding the battlefield. Ignoring advice from experienced allies and underestimating the enemy, he decided to march across the Mesopotamian desert. He thought speed and surprise would give him the advantage, but this only exhausted his troops, who arrived at the confrontation worn down by heat, thirst, and lack of adequate supplies. Meanwhile, the Parthians, led by Surina, a cunning and ruthless general, prepared for battle on terrain of their choosing. When the two armies met, Crassus positioned his troops in a defensive formation, a long compact line of legionaries. He expected a direct confrontation, where Roman strength and discipline would prevail. However, the Parthians had a completely different approach. They did not intend to face the Romans face to face. Instead, they used their most lethal weapon, mounted archers. The Parthian strategy was as simple as it was devastating. Instead of attacking head-on, mounted archers circled the Roman army, firing an incessant hail of arrows. These arrows were launched with such great force that they could pierce Roman armor, hitting soldiers who, powerless, were unable to fight back. Crassus ordered advances to disperse the archers, but they simply retreated, firing their arrows with deadly accuracy as they retreated in a technique known as the Parthian shot. As the hours passed, the battlefield of Carus turned into a scene of horror. The sound of arrows piercing the air, the screams of the wounded, and the growing despair among the legionaries were deafening. The Roman ranks began to become disorganized. The soldiers were surrounded, without water, without rest, and with their morale shattered. Each movement of advance or retreat only deepened the siege. And then, as if the rain of arrows wasn't enough, the Parthian cataphracts arrived on the scene. These knights, protected from head to toe in shining armor and armed with long spears, advanced like a wall of steel. They crushed the Roman lines with brutal force, destroying any attempt at resistance. For the legionnaires, there was nowhere to run. At the center of it all was Crassus, watching his ambition turn into disaster. He tried to reorganize his forces, but the chaos was absolute. The Roman soldiers, who were once known for their unwavering discipline, were in a panic. Many tried to flee, but the desert was as unforgiving as the Parthians, and most were captured or killed. By the end of the battle, more than 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead, and another 10,000 had been captured. It was a massacre of unimaginable proportions. Crassus, realizing that all was lost, tried to negotiate with Surinna to save what was left of his army. But even this last effort ended in tragedy. During the negotiations, an argument escalated, and Crassus was killed, ending his life in an abrupt and humiliating way. Legend has it that to mock Crassus's obsession with wealth, the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth, a cruel symbol of his greed and downfall. His body was never recovered, and his name was forever associated with the defeat. The Battle of Carus was not just a military disaster. She was a bitter lesson in how uncontrolled ambition, stubbornness, and underestimation of the enemy can lead even the most powerful to ruin. For Rome, the defeat was a profound blow, but for Crassus, it was the tragic end of a man who sought glory above all else and found oblivion on the battlefield instead. The Battle of Carus had ended in a complete disaster. The army of Marcus Licinius Crassus, which had set out full of ambition and confidence to face the Parthians, was crushed in one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. But the end of the battle was not the end of the story. Fate had an even darker and more tragic chapter in store for Crassus, a man whose obsession with wealth and military prestige would end up becoming his epitaph. After the annihilation of his troops, Crassus was trapped. His army had been reduced to disorganized fragments, and the surviving soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and surrounded by Parthian forces. He and the few remaining men sought refuge in Carus, a nearby town, but even there, safety was only temporary. The Parthians, led by the cunning general Surinna, knew they had Crassus in their hands and began to pressure him. Surinna, a master of both war and diplomacy, proposed a meeting to negotiate. He knew that capturing Crassus alive would be an even greater blow to Rome than his death in combat. Crassus, reluctantly, was convinced by his officers to accept the meeting. They believed that an agreement could save at least some of the Roman survivors. But the meeting, held on neutral ground, was a trap from the start. According to reports, Surinna organized the meeting with all the splendor characteristic of the Parthians. He arrived accompanied by an imposing escort on richly adorned horses and hosted a reception that seemed more like a victory ceremony than a negotiation. Crassus, on the other hand, was dejected, his pride wounded and his confidence destroyed. He knew he had failed, but he still hoped to save his honor and the lives of his men. However, negotiations quickly deteriorated. During the meeting, a disagreement broke out, and it is reported that Surinna deliberately provoked Crassus, insulting him and questioning his leadership. Tensions exploded, and the Parthians took advantage of the confusion to capture Crassus and his officers. For Crassus, there was no longer any escape. He was now a prisoner, at the mercy of an enemy he had so deeply underestimated. What happened next became one of the most symbolic and talked about stories of antiquity. Surinna, knowing Crassus' fame for his insatiable greed and his love of gold, decided to turn his execution into a lesson full of irony. According to tradition, Crassus was forced to kneel, and the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth, a cruel representation of his insatiable thirst for wealth. The message was clear. He who so desired gold would meet his death through it. Crassus' fate was a tragic and humiliating end for a man who endlessly sought power and glory. His capture and execution were not only a personal defeat, but also a symbolic blow to Rome, whose reputation for invincibility had been shattered. For the Parthians, it was not only a military victory but also a psychological one, a way to show the world that even the great of Rome could be overthrown. Crassus' body was never returned to Rome, and his death became a grim warning about the dangers of excessive ambition. He, who dreamed of eternal glory, was marked in history as a symbol of greed and recklessness. Crassus' capture and death was not just the end of his story, but the beginning of a legend that would echo for centuries, reminding everyone that even the most powerful can fall and that gold, while it builds empires, can also destroy them. The death of Marcus Licinius Crassus in the distant sands of Parthia was not just the end of a career marked by ambition and greed. It was also an event that shook the political structures of Rome, triggering a series of events that would culminate in the transformation of the Republic into an empire. Crassus' absence shattered the fragile balance of the first triumvirate, that carefully woven alliance between him, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, and left Rome on the brink of chaos. Crassus had been the link between the two other political giants of his day. Although he never had the popularity of Pompey or the charisma of Caesar, he was the man who, with his immense wealth and financial influence, kept the scales balanced. While Pompey controlled mass support and Caesar accumulated military glory, Crassus was the force that ensured neither became too dominant. With his death, this delicate arrangement fell apart. In Rome, news of Crassus's defeat at Carus and his humiliating death spread quickly. For many, it came as a shock that the richest man in Rome, with seemingly unlimited resources, had been defeated by an enemy considered inferior. This not only weakened the Roman image of invincibility, but also cast doubt on the ability of its leaders to make wise strategic decisions. With Crassus out of the game, the political landscape quickly polarized. Pompey and Caesar, once reluctant allies, began to grow further apart. Pompey, already suspicious of Caesar's growing ambitions, saw an opportunity to consolidate his own power in Rome. He began to align himself more closely with the Senate, presenting himself as the defender of the Republic against what many feared was Caesar's desire to become a tyrant. On the other hand, Caesar was at the height of his military glory, returning from Gaul with a series of victories that increased his popularity and power. He knew that without Crassus to balance the forces, rivalry with Pompey was inevitable. Caesar needed to ensure that his position was not threatened, and to do so, he was willing to confront Pompey and the Senate if necessary. The void left by Crassus was not only political but also strategic. His absence eliminated the possibility of mediation between the two leaders, allowing their rivalries to intensify unchecked. The Senate, realizing this, attempted to use Pompey as a counterweight to Caesar, granting him additional powers and demanding that Caesar demobilize his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar, seeing this as a direct threat to his power and legacy, refused to comply. This tension came to a head in 49 BC, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his troops, declaring war on the Senate and Pompey. The act was a definitive break with the Republican order, and the civil war that followed plunged Rome into years of violence and instability. Crassus's dream of achieving military glory was replaced by the nightmare of a collapsing republic. Crassus' death, therefore, was not just the end of a man, but a pivotal moment in Roman history. Without him, the first triumvirate collapsed, and the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar turned into a direct confrontation that would forever alter the destiny of Rome. The impact of his absence would echo for decades, leading to Caesar's rise as dictator and, eventually, the rise of the empire under Augustus. What Crassus did not achieve in life, leaving a lasting legacy of power and influence, he achieved in death, albeit indirectly and tragically. His excessive ambition and quest for glory ended up contributing to the end of the Republic and the birth of a new era in Rome. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who could have been remembered as the richest and most powerful in Rome, ended up being a figure marked by contrasts. His life was a mix of unparalleled success and disastrous failures. To this day, his name evokes reflections on excessive ambition, financial genius, and a recklessness that cost him not only the glory he so desired, but also his life. Crassus is, without a doubt, a symbol of perseverance and ingenuity. At a time when wealth was the main driver of power in Rome, he demonstrated a rare ability to turn adversity into opportunity. He lost everything during the civil wars, but rebuilt his fortune with almost superhuman determination. He knew how to take advantage of the chaos and instability to acquire land, consolidate alliances, and guarantee a solid political position. His famous firefighting brigade, which bought properties threatened by fire to resell them at sky-high prices, is a testament to his ability to find opportunities where others saw only tragedy. On the other hand, Crassus is also an example of how ambition, when left unchecked, can lead to ruin. He was not satisfied with being the richest man in Rome. He wanted to be remembered as a military hero, someone who marched through the streets of Rome in glorious triumph, surrounded by prisoners of war and conquered riches. But this quest for military prestige exposed its limitations. He underestimated formidable enemies like the Parthians, ignored strategic advice, and led his troops to a humiliating defeat at Caris. Crassus's recklessness on the battlefield highlighted a universal truth. Success in one field of life does not guarantee success in another. His financial intelligence was indisputable, but in the military field, he showed a stubbornness that bordered on arrogance, believing that his wealth and power could overcome any challenge. This excessive confidence was his downfall, leaving a clear lesson that wisdom consists in recognizing one's limits. Crassus' legacy is more complex than a simple story of victory or defeat. He played a crucial role in Rome's political history, being a key player in the first triumvirate. Without him, the alliance between Pompey and Caesar might never have been possible. His financial and political influence helped shape the Republic's destiny, albeit indirectly, by creating the conditions that led to its eventual transformation into an empire. And there is still the human side of his story. Crassus was not just a politician in general. He was a man with dreams, ambitions, and flaws. His incessant quest for recognition reflects a truth about human nature: the desire to be remembered, to leave a mark on the world. He wanted more than riches. "I wanted a place in history." Ironically, he achieved this, but not in the way he expected. Today, Crassus is remembered as an ambiguous figure. For some, he is an example of resilience and vision, someone who used his intelligence to overcome adversity and build a financial empire. For others, he is a symbol of how greed and recklessness can lead to destruction. His life teaches us that the balance between ambition and prudence is essential, and that the desire for more power, more wealth, more prestige can sometimes lead us to lose everything. In the end, Crassus achieved the immortality he sought, but his legacy is a warning as much as it is an inspiration. He reminds us that greatness is not only measured by what we accumulate, but also by the choices we make and the lessons we leave for those who come after us. Thus, Marco Licinio Crasso remains alive in history, not as the conqueror he dreamed of being, but as a figure whose triumphs and failures continue to fascinate and teach. When we talk about Marcus Licinius Crassus, it is impossible not to draw a parallel with another equally fascinating and tragic figure from ancient history: Herod the Great. Both were extraordinary men, known for their insatiable ambition, their impressive achievements, and, above all, their failures that led them to destinies marked by tragedy. Crassus and Herod represent different sides of the same phenomenon: the cost of a relentless pursuit of power and recognition. Crassus was a master of finance and politics, while Herod, the king of Judea, was known for his ability to maintain the delicate balance between Rome and his own kingdom. Both were born into positions of privilege, but were not satisfied with just inheriting their places in the world. They wanted to leave their mark, to be remembered not just as rich or powerful men, but as larger-than-life figures. Greed was a common trait between the two. Crassus, with his obsession with gold, built a colossal fortune, purchasing land and property amidst the chaos of Rome's civil wars. Herod, in turn, was known for his monumentality. He built palaces, fortresses, and the famous Temple of Jerusalem, projects that required unimaginable resources. But this search for more riches, more buildings, more glory was not enough. They wanted to be recognized as indispensable in their historical contexts, as men who transcended their origins. That same greed, however, led them to decisions that would seal their fates. Crassus, in search of a military legacy to rival those of Pompey and Julius Caesar, ignored prudent advice and launched a campaign against the Parthians that ended in disaster. He underestimated his enemies, overestimated his own capabilities, and paid the price with his life. Herod, on the other hand, became increasingly paranoid about losing power. This paranoia drove him to acts of brutality, including executing members of his own family, and isolated him from his people and allies. There is also a fascinating parallel in the way they both used politics to achieve their goals. Crassus, with his fortune, financed campaigns, bought loyalties and manipulated Rome's political system to consolidate his power. Herod, with his skillful diplomacy, secured the support of Rome, maintaining his position as king of Judea, even in the face of internal challenges. Both were brilliant strategists, but their strategies were driven more by a desire for control than by a sense of justice or duty. The end of both serves as a warning about the dangers of obsession with power and recognition. Crassus, humiliatingly killed by the Parthians, became a symbol of how greed and recklessness can lead even the most powerful to ruin. Herod, isolated and feared in his final days, is remembered as much for his achievements as his cruelty. Their stories show that power, when sought without limits or consideration for consequences, can become a trap that consumes the very man who desires it. When we reflect on Crassus and Herod, we see that their trajectories are connected by more than historical context. They embody the extremes of what ambition can reach, both dizzying heights and devastating depths. Their lives are living lessons that true greatness comes not just from what we accumulate or build, but from how we use that power and the choices we make along the way. And so, the stories of Crassus and Herod continue to resonate, reminding us that the quest for power, when driven by greed and a lack of limits, can be both a path to glory and a dangerous path to destruction. Both were men who left indelible marks on history, but who also show us that even the greatest can be brought down by their own ambitions. Thanks for watching this far. Have you already subscribed to the channel? Don't forget, because there are many more incredible Roman stories to come. See you in the next video.